Hello, everyone. Welcome to Spill the Tea in 10 with La Libre. These are 10-minute tips to give you some ideas on how to transition to more proficiency in your classroom with more emphasis on ideas that you can use tomorrow, stuff that's really helpful and helps you to work through the kinks of what it looks like to actually transition to proficiency. So let's get into those nitty-gritty details today. Today's topic is a really, really good question that came from the audience about how proficiency and ideas rooted in CI are so fun and they give great results in the classroom, but there's always this huge snag with the logistics of makeup work. What do you do when a student is absent in a CI-oriented classroom? Huge thing that we need to address, right? To make this easier for teachers to get on board with. You are exactly right, person who asked this question. This is something that we need to address. So absentees they're a reality for every teacher and they're a reality for every classroom. And I would say, especially in the middle school and high school realm, this is going to be a big deal. So when we're trying to figure out how can we better serve students that are absent, maybe occasionally, as well as how do we make our lives a lot easier when we have students that are chronically absent and still be able to serve them well. Here are a few ideas that I have for you that are very practical and take a lot of the work off of your plate. The first thing that I would suggest that you do is when you are in a classroom that is focused on acquisition, it's much more difficult to assign makeup work. And that's why this question even exists, right? Because if you are doing traditional book work, you can just assign them some pages in the book, right? Well, and guess why it's so easy to do at home? Because it's not actually acquisition driven. So what work can you assign a student at home that would actually make a difference in their language learning journey? A. B, would still help them feel like they're still catching up with work. And C, is not too much work for you. That's what we're here for today. So here are some suggestions that I have for you. Number one, this is going to take you the long game to get to the final stage of it, but you can easily get to level 1 of this pretty quickly with just 3 or 4 things in your bank. And I would say have a makeup work bank. What does that look like? It means that you're going to drop the idea of having students complete the exact same work that their peers are doing in class if it doesn't really mesh up with the absentee. For example, if you did a speaking and listening practice in class for 45 minutes that day, how are you going to replicate that at home? Not really. So what you can do, like not the exact same one, right? So what you can do is instead of trying to assign them something that looks very similar to the activity that you did that day in class, is when they come back to class that day, or, if they ask for the work in advance, you can direct them to either, a folder or a web page somewhere on your Google Classroom, whatever platform that you use if you're a Microsoft school, and have saved for them a place where they can go if they are absent from school that has 4 to 5 different assignments. Those assignments they can rotate through, called like the missing work bank or the absentee bank, whatever you want to call it. They can rotate through those and turn them in if ever they are absent from class, and you can give them different things. It could be a very generic Flipgrid like assignment, or you could do this on Pear Deck too, or on Google as well, where you give them a couple simple prompts of things that you would learn throughout the year, such as if you're in a Spanish 1 classroom and you know that you're going to be doing house vocabulary and learning about friendships and about food, you could give them 3 or 4 questions that are based on those 3 or 4, different topics, so that they can get them throughout the year. And it would say, answer these 3 or 4 questions depending on which unit we're currently in. So you only have to make one of them for the whole year, and say things like, what are the rooms in your house? Please answer this question on Flipgrid. If we're currently in the unit about friendships, please answer 3 defining traits of your friend. What did they look like? What do they like to do? What do they not like to do? Please answer on Flipgrid. Know what I mean? then you only have to make one of that copy for some speaking practice. And that would be presentational by nature, right? You're not going to be able to replicate an interpretive, or interpersonal, I should say. So maybe that's one of the things that's in your absentee work bank. Another thing that could be in your absentee work bank is something like research a francophone country. Find for me a person from that country. Why are they famous? Where do they live? Write a paragraph in French, or, like 2 to 3 sentences in French about who they are, some personality traits, some things that they're interested in, why they're famous, what their, I don't know, what their favorite food is, whatever you want. Something that still has them practicing their proficiency, where they have to look up a couple different materials, interact with some authentic text, but they're doing the work for it. And since it's from a different francophone country, you're not the one creating the work. They're the one doing the research. And so maybe that might be activity number 2 in your work bank. The third thing that you can do is have a very open-ended writing prompt that you're expecting different levels of completion depending on what point of the year they are in. So for example, it could be like the speaking assignment. You could say, choose one of 4 prompts, if you know that those are the 4 units that you do throughout the year, and ask them to write as much as they can about one of the 4 topics below. Here are the requirements. I'm looking for this, this, and this, and I'm going to be grading for this, this, and this. Google Translate will not be accepted, that whole deal. That is a really easy way for them to practice their writing skills, and which students are going to use Google Translate when they actually turn in their papers, and you can make them write it again if they don't, or if they do, rather. That's a really easy thing to put in the absentee content bank for things that they need to do. Another thing that you could put in this rotating content bank is something like, what if you asked a student to go to 3 or 4 specific websites that are incredible for language learners? If it's a website that is completely in Japanese and it's impossible for them to navigate it in English, and you ask them a couple questions about that website to ensure that they're actually working through it and having some fun with it, that's a great way to have students practice their language and interaction skills at home. Have a few of those websites saved up and give students the option, hey, these are 3 websites I want you to look at. Choose one that you like, and then do this follow-up activity. Okay, so it's difficult for me to give you like a verbal example of this, but I hope that you're seeing as we go through these examples that choose a couple open-ended activities that students can do throughout the year that still require them to use relevant to your topics, your units, whatever your language focus is at the time, but make it fairly open-ended so that students are still practicing, but you do not have to create for them a whole bunch of day-specific or week-specific work. Because if you ever taught 150 students on a roster, you know how difficult it is to create makeup work for students and then to receive it, grade it. It's very, very difficult, especially when you're in a classroom that doesn't use a lot of worksheets and all of those things. So that's a way that you can make this happen, where students can still get some language input from what they've been doing in class. That's one option for you. Another option for you that is, and one more thought before we move on to the next option, is that with this whole absentee work bank, is you start off with 3 or 4 activities that you make as you go, as you make them as you go throughout the year for students as they ask for it. So, you might not need it until September when you have the first student absent. You make them an activity and then you save it. You keep it in there for the next student that's absent and they do the same activity. No big deal. And then as you go throughout the year, you might finish the year with 6 or 7 different options. And hey, you have them for next year. Boom, ready to go. Or you at least have templates that you can use for different levels for them to work with. One more thought on this too is that as you go along, the more things that you have in that absentee content bank, the better. You can really get away with not having to do very much work at all for makeup work students or even homebound students if you have a lot of things in there for them to work with. And I mean, you can go really deep. Like you can make I used to have a whole list of authentic YouTube channels and websites and resources for them to explore that was native speaker created content. And then I would ask them some questions about some of my very favorite resources and rotate them throughout each student who needed it so that I could use the resource over and over again if it was really good. And by the end of it, you might even have 20 things that you'd be able to work through, depending on what part of the year you're in, what will work well for that student, what actually hits the skill that student missed that day in class, etc., etc. Okay, so that's option one for you, is to create a content bank for your students that is specifically for absentee work that you do not use in everyday class. The next option that I have for you works really well, but does require like a teeny tiny bit of setup on your part and your comfort level, and that is film yourself in class or create little vignettes, which is, tiny 5-minute movies during your planning period. Record yourself doing the essential skills that your students ask you about over and over and over and over again, and make a video that students can just watch over and over again and learn the skills that you're talking about from home, or record a story that you use a lot for high frequency verbs and post it somewhere on your classroom website so that students have access to it at all times. This is, by the way, the way that learning is moving right now, is being able to have, it's kind of like a flipped classroom situation where students of any content material have access to it, like what you're doing right now, have access to a video that allows them to explore the material in short bite-sized pieces and learn one specific skill or absorb a specific amount of language, maybe 10 functional chunks. And then you give them a follow-up activity to further absorb more of that input. If you're maybe working on a book and that book is not available for them at home, maybe you only have a certain amount of copies, record yourself reading the passages of that book and then post it on your classroom website so that students have access to it and can practice listening to you. That's incredible input for your students who are away from class that day. When you have, and of course, you're not going to start with 3 million videos. You're going to have 2 or 3. And then when the next subject comes up that students are asking about a lot, you just whip out your phone and record a quick video and upload it to your classroom website. And then by the end of the year, you have a whole library, a whole content library of things that students can work through and use. Follow-up idea with that activity is make it even easier, and you can film yourself during class if you keep the camera at an angle that's away from students' faces. And then you could even post entire classes of, if you know that you're going to be doing something that's very beneficial for students to have at home or very hard to replicate at home. For example, if you are doing a story or a write and discuss or a majorly crucial TPR lesson or TPRS lesson, record it and then post it for your students to have, or for them to use as a review at any point. Like, what could be better than that, right? For them to have access to more of you, that's amazing. The third idea that I have for you is adapt the materials that you're using in class in a way where they can kind of work from home with it. So if you are doing some sort of activity in class that's not really replicable at home, could you maybe turn what was a listening activity into an interpretive reading activity by just printing out the transcript of the video that you were working with and then writing out a couple questions on the bottom? How can you slightly adapt what was done in class so that it's easy for the student to pick up where they left off? That is very situational and is going to depend on what you did in class that day and what the student is looking for. And I would say that the last thing that I recommend to you is that if it happens, because it does, and it is okay, it is completely okay, is that you're currently in a transition stage where you might be in doing some classes very legacy style or traditional style, and some classes are very input driven and very proficiency oriented and very task oriented with language. But not every class is going to be like that because this method is difficult to transition into. It requires a couple days like this and a couple days like this and a couple days like this and a couple days like this. There's nothing wrong with sending your student home if you know that they're going to be away for a week on vacation and giving them some worksheets and some things that will help with their language skills and their cultural skills, even if the paper's all in English, if it makes your job easier at the end of the day. There's nothing wrong with that. There's absolutely nothing wrong with that. As long as you are giving students work that is fair, work that is doable for them, and you're giving them fair expectations for their completion. So cut yourself a break. This is one of the hardest aspects of transitioning to proficiency is what on earth am I going to do about kids that are absent? And that happens and it matters. We need to address it. So if using worksheets helps to alleviate a lot of stress in your classroom as you're transitioning, go for it and don't let anybody tell you otherwise. You can always eliminate it later when you have more resources under your belt. But right now, you're probably not working with a lot, so it's okay. So let's recap with some of the strategies that we've got. Number one, I highly recommend that instead of trying to replicate what you did in class, because it's impossible, make sure that students know that attendance is paramount, and it will become evident when you send them makeup work and they're like, this wasn't like what we did in class. Well, yeah, I know. You can't really do the same things that we do in class at home. So if makeup work were easy, then the instruction would not be as high quality for language. So keep that in mind. My first suggestion for you is to make yourself a content bank of easily usable materials from throughout the year by keeping them really open-ended and on all different topics and sections of your year. My second suggestion for you is create videos for your students or video the work that you're already doing so that they can access it. And the third thing that I would suggest for you is slightly adapt anything that you're doing in class so that it's work that students can easily take home. If you worked on a speaking assignment in class, can you turn it into presentational for your students to work on at home? There's probably options for you. And the very last one is that, at the end of the day, if you need to send them home with some basic worksheets, there's no problem with that, as long as they're still practicing their skills. So I hope that that's helpful for you to get a better grasp on what it means to transition to proficiency in today's day and age. Thank you so much for being here, and I'm glad that we got to hang out together, and I will see you next week for Spill the Tea in 10 with La Libre. Bye for now. Au revoir.